Well, so today again we got Dan Pfaff, the head coach of Altus. Used to coach at USATF UK Athletic and coach several sprinters. So, coach, like, am I missing something? Am I missing anything?
No, my CV is all over the shop, so that's plenty.
Cool. So, I know last time we talked about like mechanics of sprinting. Uh, Today I want to kind of want to talk about change of direction, but like I want to start with curvilinear sprint, like high jump do. So, first of all, like in long jump, there's a runway for jumpers to like prepare themselves to to maybe like jump like 7 meters or 8 meters. But like for high jump, they only have like so limited space to prepare for their jump. So how is that possible that they like jump like 2 meters with so limited like space?
Well, generally, in the horizontal jumps, world-class athletes take 18 to 20 steps, where in the high jump, it's probably more like 10 to 12 steps because of the space confines. So they have to maximize each section of the run a lot more than a horizontal jumper. So they have to really be efficient at each phase of the run. In general, half of the run is done linearly, and then half of the run is done curve linear. So it's really important on the linear part that you accelerate well and you get up to a given velocity. And then on curve linear run, the ability to maintain that velocity or slightly increase it is a very important skill.
So, when you teach curvilinear sprint, what are some things you're gonna look at?
Well, the first thing I think that coaches need to realize is the demands on sides of the body are very different. So the inside foot is kind of like the rudder of the ship. That's the foot axis is doing most of the turning, and the outside foot is more occupied with fighting centripetal forces. You know, the forces trying to pull you out of the curve. So there's two big differences in demands upon the body. The inside leg is doing rotational dynamics, and the outside leg is doing lateral force application to fight these centripetal forces that we're talking about. So there's going to be asymmetry in muscular demand and possible injuries because of these split demands, if you will. So my first thing that I look at in curvilinear running is the inside foot doing the turning and the rotation, and is the outside foot fighting centripetal force as well. Lean is a product force. So when you start your acceleration, you have a lot of lean, and as you get up to speed, you have less and less lean. And then in curvilinear running, as you increase velocity, there's more and more inward lean because you're fighting forces more greatly with that outside leg. So we look at the amount of inward lean, is it commensurate to the velocity that they're running? Foot axis tracing, is the foot axis turning in a uniform manner? Um, are the body segments turning with the foot? So sometimes the athlete will have the foot axis rotating really well, but maybe the pelvis and the torso or in an opposite planar of movement or vector of movement, and that's going to reduce efficiency and increase injury risk. So we look at segmental movements and axial movements in curvilinear running with this underlying thing that the inside leg is the rotational driver and the outside leg is the force battling driver, if you will.
Cool. So, is it the same with 200 meter when they do the curve?
Yes. So that's why you'll see some people are really good at 100 meters and not, it doesn't translate to 200 meters. It could be training, but a lot of times it's their inefficiency in running the curve in the various sections of the race, that 100 meters that's done on the curve.
Cool. Um, so like sprinter like Usain Bolt, like Nolas, they're like really special, right?
Yeah, they have very good capacities and skills for running curvilinear and linear.
So, besides like the curvilinear sprint, if we're gonna talk about like more like sharp or like more sharper angle of change of direction, I know like uh coaches at Exos they're gonna divide into like change direction into like shuffle or crossover. And maybe different system they're gonna like view it different way. But coach, do you have like your own way of like categorize change direction movements?
Well, I really respect a lot of the work that Damien Harper is doing over in the UK. Uh, so I lean a lot on his research. So there's the three critical moments in a change in direction activity. So your entrance strategy is you're entering the point at where you do the most massive amount of turning. And then there's the apex moment, and that's where you're doing that radical turning. And then there's an exit strategy. So we know from skiers, like on downhill skiing, the three big injury areas are entrance into a gate, in the middle of the gate where they're doing the greatest rotation, and then the exit from the gate. So I've always kind of applied that in analyzing change in directions. Or is the athlete doing the ABCs well entering that pivot point? Are they doing the ABCs really well during the pivoting moment? And then are they doing the ABCs as they exit that big pivoting moment? So I kind of put them in those three buckets. I think that there are very different biological demands depending on velocity and the angle at which you're pivoting. So, like, a 10-meter dead stop would be a simplest, test battery that I use, a 5-meter dead stop, a 15-meter. So I do different distances to have different velocities to see the ability in a linear sense. Can they stop and control their body and maintain balance? And then my tree off that is, maybe 10 meters with a 45-degree cut, 10 meters with a 90, 10 meters with a 180. So, you can develop all kinds of trees, but it all comes back. Are they doing the ABCs, the essentials? Are they lowering the center of mass in a uniform manner? How far out are they placing their foot on the pre-penultimate and the penultimate? What are the rotational dynamics of the foot and the body segments during that key pivoting action? And then how are those body segments reacting on the reacceleration from that pivoting? So I think if we're going to do a really good job, we got to look at entrance dynamics, pivoting dynamics, and exit dynamics in a holistic manner.
Cool. And since you brought up like the ABC, like are they learning their certain mass? Where are their penultimate step? And how is the angle of the foot and the body, sorry, the knee and the body. So there's gonna be coaches talk about like or discuss like the knee and when doing deceleration or like change direction, the knee and the hip should be um I say rotating at the same speed or like work together. So what are your thoughts on like hip and knee working? Do they have to like bend at the same time?
Well, a lot of that is probably velocity dependent, skill dependent, biomotor ability dependent. So seldom do we get an athlete that has what we would call functional strength and functional power output and functional agility or movement expression abilities. So they're usually biased to one of those others, and that will affect how they execute these movements. I think our job as a coach is to try to get all three boats floating at a similar level. So we do a lot of analysis. Yeah, I mean, generally, as you're decelerating and about to pivot, you want to see the torso folding forward, the center of mass lowering, and the foot placement out in front, the braking forces in a uniform manner. So, yeah, we're looking at touchdown distance and we're looking at axial positions and we're looking at rotation of the segments. But usually there's some disharmony in those things that are traced back to A, they don't understand how to do the task, or B, they don't have the biological ability to execute the task. So they find a workaround, they find a way to cheat the system in order to get the job done.
So, uh, besides like deceleration, if they want to go out go out the cut, like change the direction, no matter like uh 45, 90, or 180, some people can say they change direction, but they go out that space by pushing their leg first, and some people can say they turn their like shoulder first. In your opinion, which happened first, or like does it really matter?
Well, I think it's somewhat task specific and sport specific. So if the athlete is watching a defender or the ball, they may lead with their head or their torso because they're tracking the ball, which is going to change the chess game downstairs. Now, if they're not having to track an external stimuli, generally you want the middle of the body to move first and then the segments proximal and distal moving behind that. But a lot of times, sport demands create a unique puzzle or challenge for these athletes. So if an athlete is tracking a defender and they're looking very, very hard to the right, tracking this defender, well, the upper body is leading that movement. So they're going to have to find a way to, bring in hip rotation and leg segmental rotation after the fact. I think this is where we probably miss the boat. We do the ABCs in a pretty close chain environment. And then when we go to open chain, those skills don't hold up.
So does does like the ABC work for like all kinds of team sport? Is it like a main principle for you?
Yeah, it is because I just find in my work, and then this is my case studies and anecdotal evidence. A lot of the guys and gals I get, they really don't. No one's ever talked about how to decelerate or change in direction. They just have done it, or maybe they mimicked what they saw on a video or what their teammate is doing, and maybe they don't have their teammates' biological abilities or skills, and so they're trying to mimic something with an engine that's not capable of mimicking that, and they end up in a kind of a bastardized paradigm. So yeah, I'm a big believer that in rehab or teaching skill or what have you, you start out, with simple and slow tasks and you master it and evolve. Like I said, I think a lot of people are doing really good close chain challenges, but we're failing on the open chain challenges, especially in return to play. So you see a lot of return to play where athletes are doing a lot of close chain, change in direction or decel type work, and then they just throw them into the game. And there hasn't been a bridge built to open chain challenges, and we see a lot of injuries in that environment.
Cool. So I still want to go back to like deceleration. I know some coaches gonna talk about like when they teach deceleration, they want full foot landing. And when I teach my athlete like full foot landing, especially basketball athlete, some of them have hard time to do the full foot. They tend to land on their forefoot. So is that a thing I need to correct, or like
Well, I, I think what you do is you study the best decelerators. And when we study the best decelerators in a lot of sports, it's usually a heel first rolling contact or a flat contact. So that's where I start out. I say, what are the best decelerators in football and rugby and NBA and NFL and ice hockey? What are they doing? And, what I see is a bias towards full footed or rolling type landings. Sometimes the inability to do that with the foot is really a hardware problem. They may have ankle or foot issues or knee issues that's preventing them from obtaining the ability to use the foot in the proper manner. So we shouldn't discount that either.
Cool, cool. So, besides like deceleration and change direction, another thing I want to kind of discuss is like elasticity. Some coaches would say there's like athlete, there's like fascia based athlete, there's a muscle based athlete, but some coaches say it's a it's a coordination thing. Are they coordinate enough to like access their elasticity? So, like, can you share your thoughts on this topic?
So I think the discussion usually gets down into observational analysis, or looking at unique metrics to determine the classification of an athlete. And why do we classify an athlete? Well, we want to, make sure that their strong points are staying strong points and that the weak points we're slowly nudging them to get better. So, in my experience, they're athletes that when under pressure, they're going to refer back to a muscular driven motor sequencing and processing and solution. And then there are other athletes based on genetics, body type, maybe some training bias that are probably going to use connective tissues to express power and movement and velocity. So I think there's a pretty good evidence out there that some athletes prefer muscular driven solutions and others prefer more connective tissue driven solutions. So elasticism to me is a gross, ambiguous term that might encompass tendons and ligaments and fascia and capsule, joint capsules, and perhaps even fluid dynamics within those collagen structures. So, kind of a gross overview, really wiry, less muscular driven athletes seem to use these elastic qualities a little bit more than the thicker, more dense, more robust built type athletes. That doesn't say that I'm going to totally bias training one realm or the other. Like I said, we're going to keep their preferences alive and polish the car there, but we're going to slowly try to nudge in some of these other qualities. I think a lot of times we have athletes that are kind of hybrids. On certain tasks, they're muscular driven, and on other tasks, they're more elastic driven. So I coached an Olympic champion in the long jump, Greg Rutherford, and he was very muscular driven on his initial acceleration and his initial acceleration steps. But then when he got upright and was sprinting, he was very elastic. But then when he went to take off, he switched over to being a little bit more muscular driven. So depending on where he was at in his event, he had motor preferences.
Oh, so in that case, that kind of mean that it is possible for like athlete to get like muscle based and like maybe they're good at both, right?
Yep.
So how I know this is a big one, but like in especially like sprinters, let's say if this sprinter is more muscle based, is it kind of like what you mentioned, like muscle based athlete all have like pretty muscle based like acceleration, and when they enter top speed, it's more elastic.
Well, I think what happens if you have a very biased muscular driven sprinter, they're going to be really good at the start and the initial accelerations on. They'll probably hang around as they're hitting top end speed, but then the rate of decay is going to be greater than an elastic athlete because elastic energy is relatively free. You know, you're not, there isn't a huge metabolic cost. So the rate of decay in a race is going to be a little less on the elastic athlete than the muscular driven athlete. Correspondingly, a muscular driven athlete is probably going to rely on horizontal force production a lot more than vertical. So that'll make them very effective the first half of the race, but the last half of the race, when fatigue is starting to interplay, that may not be your best weapon.
So, uh, in order for these like muscle-based athlete to like train their elasticity, like, um, is it simply like programming different plyo into it?
Yeah, I think plyometrics are probably the number one tool that you would use to improve elastic outputs or performances. And I think it's important if you're going to go into that realm that you address the force velocity curve. So you're doing plyometrics, you know, under load, under no load at differing velocities and whatnot, that you don't put all your eggs into one basket. So plyometric training is a very, very wide spectrum of activities. And I think where we go wrong is we get biased to a certain part of the force velocity curve and do all our work there, and then we're ignoring the rest of that curve. So I encourage coaches to have plyometric challenges that fall all along that curve, if you will.
So, uh, also for like, fa is it athlete that is more elastic or like what's so-called fascia-based athlete? If we put like too much like muscle mass on them or like too much max strength, hypertrophy, is that gonna take away their talent?
In my experience, yes. You know, I think it's pretty common to see, you know, in university American football, wide receivers and defensive backs and whatnot go in and get really deeply involved in a strength training program that makes them a lot bigger and a lot more mass, and they slow down or they lose their ability to express movement and change interaction because of that change. So yeah, that's always a concern for me. You know, if I got a pure greyhound going into a university football setting, is, you know, does the strength and conditioning staff understand the type of athlete that they
So, how for these athletes, how can we like know when to like back off for the strength training?
Oh, you know, it's probably a PhD question. I think some of it's going to evolve on your assessment toolbox. So, what kind of jump assessments are you doing? What kind of change in direction assessments are you doing? What kind of running assessments are you doing? And are those being positively affected or negatively affected or no? So, I think the screening assessment component is super important in that. So, like maybe force platform use, you know, various drop jumps from various heights would change the force velocity dynamic. Are they improving on all of those, or something declining? Um, you know, contact time on the ground and upright sprinting would be another variable. So, say you put a lot of weight training on them and their contact time increases and their flight time decreases, well, now you got a problem.
So, uh, is that also why like a lot of basketball players don't like to do like strength training in the state? They think that that's gonna take away like their talent on it.
I think there's a couple drivers on that one. You know, there's this myth if you get it stronger, it'll affect their shot or what have you. So that myth is still hanging around. I think a lot of times basketball players will go in the weight room rehabbing or doing a return to play, but as a staple in their training program, it's not high on their priority list. Skill has a higher priority than strength or power output. Now, some guys, positionally, maybe they need to put on mass. It's obvious they're getting shoved around, so they got to get a little bit bigger or they got to get a little bit stronger. So there's a big chess game going on there on what motivates an athlete to go into the weight room or not. I think some of these guys are real racehorses, and maybe in college or university they were forced to lift, and they got injured a lot, or they felt like they weren't moving freely. So now that they have the option, they're gonna probably not pick it up because they had a negative experience with bias training.
So, uh, what are like if we I know because if we do isometric, that's good for tendon health, and we know um more elastic athlete they tend to have like tendon. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they tend to have like tendon issue, like knee pain, those or at least tendon pain. If we mainly let them do like isometric squat or like split stance, and other just let them do their thing, jump, sprint. Is that enough for those athletes?
Well, that's another PhD question. I personally think tendon health is a very complex puzzle. A lot of times it's a hardware problem. The joints aren't moving the way they're supposed to, and tendinopathy occurs as a result. So, can you blame that on programming? It's kind of a reach if you got big hardware problem. I think that the interface of isometrics and eccentric control and concentric outputs is a delicate balancing act. So, my question on tendon health are we overcooking one of those spheres of influence? So, isometrics are really popular right now, but in my experience, yielding isometrics and overcoming isometrics are two different entities. And I think there's a bias right now in the industry to overcoming isometrics rather than yielding. Yielding's a lot harder to implement and design. So I think there's a gap there. I think eccentric control, again, I don't think we do a real good assessment on that, on a variety of measures. So you may have really good isometric qualities, but you have very poor eccentric control. Yeah, you're going to have connective tissue injuries. So these connective tissue injuries are driven by a lot of variables, hardware problems, bias training, things of that nature. In general, doing your sport task will train elastic tissues at a certain quality. But sometimes, and Barr refers to this in some of his talks and his lectures, that if you overdevelop elastic expression and underplay muscular expression, then tendons are at higher risk. So this balancing act of what do we do to the muscular system versus the tendon ligament system, that's kind of a puzzle. That's the art of coaching. So I see a lot of this too in sprinters where they stop weight training, 2 months out from the major. And so the muscle system depowers, if you will, and the elastic system upregulates, and they get muscular injuries because of that. So I think it's a balancing act that we have to, you know, rum around in our brains a little bit on, are we addressing these systems in an equal fashion or in a respectful, commensurate fashion?
So, uh, I know, Coach Wu like to say when he coach like maybe like sprinters or like jumpers in season, he don't like the athlete to do heavy back squat, but he do uh heavy Olympic lifting. Is that the same case with you?
Well, I think Olympic lifting is probably addressing more variables than a heavy static lift. Um, so I think with an Olympic lift, you're probably addressing connective tissue and muscular systems in a unique relationship where a heavy static lift is probably super biased to the muscle system and not putting much load on the connective tissue system.
So, I mean, if we're training like team sport athlete, can we do the same thing with maybe like do less static lifting, but more like Olympic lifting?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of people that are anti-Olympic lifting, but more dynamic lifting options would probably be my preference. So, like hex bar jumps, squats, or split squat, dynamic split squat interface or something like that, where you're creating a dynamic recruitment pathway and challenge rather than a static, very planar pattern.
So, uh, I know in artist presentation you once said that you coach like three sub 10 athlete and they don't really like to do heavy like heavy strength training. So when it comes to like strength training, do you use like those stuff you mentioned and kind of focus on like eccentric stuff, especially for sprinters?
Well, like I said, in a perfect world, I like to challenge athletes everywhere in that force velocity curve with exercises. Now, I've had some sprinters because of bad experiences or a negative attitude that have refused to lift, and they ran very fast, but they fought a lot of injuries as a result. So that was the return on investment decision they made. They were willing to put up with the injuries to avoid the weight room. Hindsight, almost all of them said, yeah, I probably should have done a little bit of lifting. What that lifting looked like, you know, it, it had to be a progression in getting them comfortable with, being in the weight room and trusting the weight room and showing them that it didn't negatively affect their health or their performance on the field. And that's no easy ask.
Cool. And you mentioned several times about like force velocity curve. Um, and I know this is a debate, but like some coaches also gonna say like force velocity curve, it comes out from like one single muscle fiber, and it's not able to represent like how we move because we have like connective tissue like tendon ligaments, and our mu our muscle probably don't work like a single muscle fiber, and also like when it comes to, like sprinting or like jumping, it's much higher force. There's gonna be like 4 or 5 times body weight. So what are our thoughts on like these kind of topic?
Well, I've always believed the weight room is an ancillary support mechanism, shouldn't be the driver for performance. That said, on the research on force velocity, I just step back and say, okay, I'm looking at the power output and the velocity of the movement. And so where do I exist on a continuum? So whether it's a jump squat with a certain load, a jump squat with a bigger load, and what does that look like in the athlete? How far fast is the bar moving? How high did they jump with that load and all of that? So I think sometimes we go down rabbit holes arguing about research, and we just kind of need to step back and look at the big picture a little bit rather than arguing over minutia.
Nice, nice. So, another topic I kind of want to ask about today is about like, uh, change like some biomechanic model for like the France ball system. So, I know we kind of like talked about this before, but I want to start by like, uh, we last time we talked about the hip movement, hip oscillate when sprint or like jump. But what about change of direction? When they change of direction, does their hip also move at the direction they they want to go, or like it's kind of stay stable?
No. I mean, the pelvis is really a gyroscope in movement. So as we decelerate, the pelvis has a tendency to rotate forward, and as we pivot, one side of the pelvis has a tendency to tilt, and the other side to elevate. And like we said earlier, the inside foot is doing most of the redirection, and the outside foot is fighting centrifugal forces. So uh, what the ilium is doing on one side and the ilium on the other side are totally different tasks. So I think the pelvis is very dynamic during the entire change in direction process. It's doing unique things on the entrance strategy. It's doing very unique things on the pivoting strategy, and it's doing other unique things on the exit strategy. So it's a dynamic gyroscope, if you will. I don't think you may capture a frame and say, look, it's here, it's static, but that's one frame. I mean, if you're really doing slow motion analysis, you're seeing, tilting of the pelvic axis. You're seeing one ilium in front of the other. And then, so you're seeing oscillation and undulation and rotational, like in flare, out flare of the ilium. So to me, the best way I describe it to athletes is the pelvis is a gyroscope, and it's constantly redirecting or reorienting in order to keep you in balance.
And does also our shoulder kind of counterbalance the hip movement we do when teams or athletes do change the direction?
Well, in in all movements, the shoulder axis has to complement and be comparable to what's going on in the pelvic region. So if the pelvis is doing this kind of work, shoulder axis is doing that kind of work in an opposite phasic. And that's something that we measure and analyze. A lot of athletes have very rigid shoulder axes during change in direction and very mobile hip axes, and that's a disconnect, and that's going to reduce output ability and it's going to increase injury risk, in my experience.
So, I know last time we kind of talked about this, but this kind of made me think about like when we talk about sprinters, uh, or like athlete sprint, sometimes they saw their hip oscillate, but like their upper body is like slamming both side. Is that a thing? Is that gonna harm their performance?
Well, I think what you're probably describing here is lateral flexion of the torso during gait. So I think there's this misnomer that body segments are pretty rigid or neutral in gait, and that doesn't happen. So as we talked on the other podcast, the ilium at toe off has anteversion, and then it comes neutral during the leg recovery, and then it has retroversion during the sweep back. And that's going on. The shoulder axis is doing that in the opposite phasing. So these things are constantly reacting to one another, and I think the lack of harmony between these axes is a big red flag, and it's something that we chase down. It's super important that these things are harmonic and moving in a cooperative manner. Rigidity to me is a red flag. So if I see something not moving very much, that's usually a red flag. So this lateral listing, so when we sprint, at toe off, there's going to be slight total body lean. And then during recovery, the total body axis comes to neutral. And then as the leg sweeps out and comes into the ground, there might be slight retroversion of the entire line. So the longitudinal axis is never perfectly rigid in high speed sprinting. There's a little bit of tilt and then neutral and a little bit of backward tilt. Well, same thing if you look from the rear, you're going to have lateral listing to the contact point. So whatever side of the body's contacting the ground, the body's going to lean that way in order to increase force production. And then when we go to the other side, it's going to lean to increase force production on that side. So what we want to see is a symmetrical amount of leaning, where if we have excessive leaning on one side and almost none on the other, now we got problems going on in the hardware. The pelvis or the spine is not moving in a cooperative manner. And that's why they're over listening to one side and under listening to the other. So this lateral listing puzzle is, and it's somewhat velocity dependent. So a lot of athletes will have more lateral listing during the initial steps than they do when they're upright. So at high forces and low velocities, if they're power deficient, they're going to have a lot more lateral lean because they're having to come up with a way to produce the amount of power needed. It's also tied to attack angle. So if you attack too low, then you're going to laterally lean because you're falling into the next step and you're trying to improve your braking force capability because of this too steep of an attack angle. So I think there's several drivers on lateral lean. Big picture short is we want to see symmetry. And generally, we want to see more lateral lean during acceleration and less lateral leaning during sprinting. That would be a perfect world.
Nice, nice, nice. So the next thing I'm gonna go the next thing I'm gonna go back to like the probably the first thing we were talking about is like curvilinear sprint, and you said that one side's doing the rotation, one side's doing the what is it called?
Fighting centrifugal
Yeah,
force.
yeah, sorry. So do you do like let's say for 200-meter or like high jumper, they kind of like do the curvilinear sprint on one way. So when you train them, do the other side of the curvilinear sprint.
I've tried that, but to be honest, I've never had a whole lot of success with that.
So uh is it like because my thought is like if we only focus on one side, isn't that gonna like increase their injury rate if we kind of
Yep,
balance it? Is if we kind of
yep,
balance it? But I know
yep,
like you mentioned, that's sometimes not gonna help a lot.
yep. I think that's the price we pay for, running in a unique way in a unique activity. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
why you gotta, be on top of your sports medicine game.
cool, cool. I like it. I like it. Thank you, coach. I think that's all I have for you today. I appreciate it.
All right, not a problem. Happy to help, and you always ask good questions.
I'm sorry I'm all over the place.
No, it's all right.